In this video, I'm showing some hacks and some modifications that I use with winter sowing. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. Winter sowing is an incredible method that's created by Trudy Geisel Davidoff. The classic method is easy and it's very effective. If you've never tried winter sowing, I would highly recommend that you watch part 1 of this series, which I'll link in the video's description. To boil it down, the classic original version of winter sowing is starting seeds by sowing them in translucent or clear containers with venting and draining holes and at least 3 inches of potting mix or soil. This is strictly done during winter and works with Mother Nature and your area's climate to grow tough, hardy young plants to plant out in your garden in the spring. All of the details about exactly how to do it successfully are in that part 1 video. The primary reason that I love this method so much is how easy it is. However, as I've used this method over the years, I've really pushed the envelope and found some shortcuts, hacks, and sort of modifications that have increased my success. I love a good experiment, so I'm always looking to learn through trial and error. I also sometimes break a few rules for the sake of learning and figuring out what works best for me. I really need to emphasize here that if you choose to follow any of these modifications, you are no longer winter sowing. You're breaking the basic rules of the classic concept of winter sowing. It should also be noted that I'm not guaranteeing that these applications will work for you in your location or your growing zone. What's most important when considering these modifications is that you understand the patterns and conditions you've learned about growing in your climate and your seasons. If you have experience starting seeds and growing plants in your location, you'll be able to discern what might work well, what might be risky to try, and what will not be possible where you are. To me, any experimenting results in harvesting lessons, and that is as important to me as a grower as harvesting the resulting food or flowers. But there is something for everyone here. Just pick and choose what you want to try based on your goals and location. I also want to figure out what works best for specific types of plants and figure out what works best for my situation and my environment. Winter sowing is a perfectly great, effective method on its own, but if you want to do your own experimenting, you may want to give some of these modifications a try. The first modified method I want to share with you is winter sowing in soil blocks. Now, the only rule that this really breaks with winter sowing is the recommended 3-inch depth of the soil that you put in the containers. One thing I don't love about winter sowing is how easy it is to overcrowd the containers with seeds when you're sowing them. It can be really difficult to separate baby plants when you're transplanting out if the roots are all tangled together in a container. Growing them in 2-inch soil blocks gives each plant its own soil space, and it allows the roots to air prune and have more access to air, which improves growth and creates healthier baby plants. If you're a grower that wants to plant each plant separately with typical recommended spacing, this is a great hack to use. The way I do this is in flat containers. So just like you would with any other winter sowing, you need vent holes on the lid of the container and holes on the bottom for drainage. I like to repurpose clear Rubbermaid type or shoebox sized containers for this. After some trial and error, I've found it best to put the holes on the outer edge and corners of the lid so that when you water or when it rains and the moisture enters the container, it sends the water to the bottom of the container rather than beating down on the soil blocks from directly above and eroding the soil. Oh, hey Luke. Luke's here. I just can't be out here before Luke finds me. So then the drain holes I've found work best when they're in the center of the container, on the bottom of the container, and that forces the water to saturate the soil blocks and move all the way to the center blocks before the excess water drains out of the bottom. If you choose to water by hand, be sure you do that carefully in a corner of the container so that you're not washing away your soil blocks. It also helps to have at least 2 inches of headspace above the plants. Depending on what type of seeds you're growing, you might want to sow 2 per soil block, just so that you can later thin to 1 plant per block. And although classic winter sowing requires you to plant out plants when they're 2 to 3 inches tall and they have 2 sets of true leaves, the soil block spacing allows for the transplants to actually get bigger. I'd recommend 4 to 5 inches maximum before you plant them out. And that buys you a little bit of extra time before you have to transplant them. It also makes it way easier to separate plants and transplant them out. The second modification I have for you is winter sowing outside of winter. This obviously breaks rule number 1 when it comes to winter sowing, but there are some benefits to the method that you can really utilize all year long. I love that it's a really inexpensive way to start seeds, and it utilizes the sun and fluctuating temperatures outside to give you well-adapted transplants. I've found that sowing in the vented greenhouse style containers can work very well in any season. It works well to protect seeds and baby plants from critters, and it allows them to grow in the outdoors and already be adapted to the conditions outside. In summer, I found it was easy to put these in a kiddie pool on my porch in the shade, and they germinated and grew just fine. I grew my fall brassica plants this way, and it worked out really well. I just had to make sure that the soil didn't dry out, and I found that that was easier to accomplish by keeping them in the shade and filling the kiddie pool with a shallow amount of water for the containers to stay hydrated, especially here in our North Texas summers where the temperatures are in the triple digits Fahrenheit. And I love that the containers protect the seeds and baby plants from critters in the summer, because we have really high pest pressure in the summer and early fall. And in the heat of the summertime, to make sure I'm providing enough ventilation to them, I'll grow them without the lids and drape insect netting over the top to keep the grasshoppers and moths from eating and laying eggs on the plants. And starting seeds in vented containers like this can also work very well in spring and fall as well. The common sense part of winter sowing is that when you use the classic method by sowing in the winter, the seeds only sprout when the conditions and the climate are ready. So that takes the guesswork out of when to sow and plant. Makes it super easy. If you color outside of the lines and you start your seeds in summer, fall, or later in the spring, it's more important to know which plants are going to do well in your climate and serve your purposes. You should also know the days to maturity of what you're trying to grow to make sure that you can get a harvest. For example, the cool-loving veggies that I started outside on the porch in the summer, they were successful because I knew that they would be okay in the fall conditions. They really appreciated the cooler weather, and they're still growing now here in December. And because they don't mind the freezes and frosts, they're still going strong. Now, if your first frost is in, say, September, I would not start tomatoes from seed in July. It's going to be highly unlikely that you're getting a harvest from that. You can also really push the envelope by fall sowing, but you do have to understand your winter temperatures to know what plants you can feasibly plant out in November to January. I should add that if your soil is frozen all winter, you're not going to be able to plant out in that. So that's not to say that you couldn't grow in a cold frame or a polytunnel where the soil is going to be warmer and you're able to plant in it. But your growing zone or plant hardiness zone is going to help you know what to plant. Plant hardiness zones in the U.S. are based on average annual extreme minimum winter temperature. So we're in North Texas on the edge of Zone A and 8B, which tells me that on average, the coldest winter temperature that we tend to experience is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 12 degrees Celsius. But our winter weather in particular fluctuates in really big ways. Our winters can be warm for a few weeks, but they can also dip down to the single digits. A couple of years ago, it was actually 90 degrees Fahrenheit on Christmas Day. And the year after that, we had temperatures drop into the negatives Fahrenheit, which is more characteristic of Zone 6B. So you just have to be really aware of the possibilities and the conditions in your area for winter temperatures. and be prepared to cover or not cover plants, depending on what your plan is. Here in North Texas, I've found that I can get away with planting many cool, hardy annual flowers, natives, perennials, and cool loving veggies in December or January with the added protection of hoops and row cover, plastic low tunnels, or the sealed off high tunnel. These situations all prove to help keep soil warmer and help the roots to get established. To check the hardiness of a plant, I like to do a web search with the name of the plant, and then I'll type in hardy to zone. That will generally tell me the zone that the plant will survive. Those plants that will be perennial or hardy in my zone are the ones that I will consider trying to winter sow early in containers and more like fall, and then plant out to overwinter. These are hardy veggies like kale, lettuce, leeks, chard, spinach, and then slightly less hardy veggies like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, or Brussels sprouts. Or I love to plant hardy flowers like snapdragons, poppies, yarrow, feverfew, pansy, or delphinium in the fall as well. This is always going to be somewhat risky, but sometimes risks in gardening pay off. The third modification I have for you is forcing germination. Typically with classic winter sowing, there's no choosing the time that your seeds germinate. They germinate when the outdoor conditions are right, and there's some real advantages to that because when they're 2 inches or they have 2 sets of true leaves, the weather will generally be right for them to be planted out, and it just kind of all times out nicely. However, there are some cases when you may want to cheat and germinate your seeds early. The most likely time you would want to do this is to get a head start on your spring starts that are more tender annuals. And there are a couple of ways to do this to force germination. One way is to put a heating mat underneath the container that you want to sprout early. If the temperatures are cold but not freezing outside, this is one way that you can do it. The heating mat will warm the soil, especially at night when the sun is not out on the containers and keeping the soil warm. The container will hold some of the heat because it is enclosed and it will help keep the soil warm. But if you don't want to buy a heating mat, another method is you can bring your containers in your house and keep them at the room temperature in your house between 68 and 75 degrees. And you can keep them inside until you see the seeds crack and little seedlings start to gooseneck out of the soil. If you're doing this, it's very, very important that you check them frequently. So as soon as you see them sprouting, you just take that container and you'll thrust it out into the sun and cold temperatures. Again, this does not work for warm weather frost tender annuals if you have freezing temperatures outside, because they're not going to survive that. But it's an option if you want to get a head start growing those tomatoes that need warm soil to germinate. And believe it or not, those little tiny, very newly birthed, baby tiny seedlings will do just fine adapting to the temperatures outside as long as you get them out there quickly, just as soon as they germinate and start to pop. Another point to mention on this is your seedlings will be growing ahead of schedule in this case. So they're going to need to be potted up into their own 3 or 4 inch pots, or you can use solo cups when they have those true leaves. In this case, I like to keep multiple containers inside of a big clear tote to keep them outside and also keep them all together and make them easy to move and transport. With classic winter sowing, the guideline is that you plant out baby plants when they are 2 inches tall or have 2 sets of true leaves. So we're essentially breaking this rule. However, if there's risk of frost, you're not going to want to risk planting your warm season annuals out when they're that tiny by planting them out before your last frost. So up potting them and protecting them inside of a plastic tote, and also having the ability to bring them inside at night when temperatures drop will keep them alive for you. I should mention also that soil temperature is very important for plants. So if there's a plant that is heat loving, you might want to consider leaving the heat mat underneath those plants that you're trying to grow outside. Peppers are an example of this. They don't like their roots any cooler than 60 degrees or it can severely stunt their growth. And you can use a soil thermometer to check the temperature of the soil. Now this modification does add the extra step of really watching the weather. When there's risk of frost or freeze, you do have to move those plants inside at night, or if it's kind of borderline, you can cover with frost fabric or a blanket to make sure that tender annuals stay alive outside. But it can allow you to grow some of those plants larger more quickly so that you can have a harvest quicker in the spring or early summer. My fourth modification is overprotecting baby plants. So this kind of goes along with the last modification. This is the first rule that I ever tried breaking with winter sowing, and I really just couldn't help myself. So with classic winter sowing, the plants in their containers stay outside no matter what. What results is natural culling, and only the strongest plants survive. But what I found is our winter temperatures in North Texas fluctuate quite a bit. I've certainly lost some plants due to the weather getting too cold for them. Sometimes a few from a container, and then sometimes I would lose a whole container or tray. But I did not like losing plants. There's just something inside my heart that hurts when I lose plants. Our coldest weeks in North Texas are at the end of January and the early part of February. So during that time, when we would get nights that were below freezing, multiple nights in a row, I would baby the plants. Typically, I would drape a wool blanket over the group of containers outside. When we would have a longer cold snap, colder than 28 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 degrees Celsius for several hours, instead of leaving the plants outside when I know that I would be putting them in danger, I would bring them inside and put them near some windows in a room, which usually stays pretty cool anyway in the winter, and I would just protect them from those super cold temperatures. The winter sowing purists would not want to hear about me bringing plants inside, but yes, I have saved my baby plants from the impending doom of a polar vortex. When I do this, I end up with far more plants than our crazy North Texas weather would have allowed me to have. The reason I think this makes sense for my climate is that our temperatures fluctuate so much in the winter and into the spring that sometimes we will have a warm spell in the winter that will make some seedlings germinate in their containers a little bit early when they're not actually free of danger. We will sometimes have winters that are more mild, where we have very few nights below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius, or we will have winters where we get a cold snap with lows in the single digits Fahrenheit or -10 Celsius. So depending on the weather that year, classic winter sowing can give me a lot of overgrown plants, or without a little protection, polar air can leave me nothing at all. I just try to balance this out so that I don't lose them all, but I still want them exposed to those fluctuating temperatures and a good deal of cold so that they're hardier plants. My last modification is eliminating containers. This is essentially direct sowing in the winter or early spring, but with clear cover. This situation, which is dependent upon the weather, involves using clear containers or clear tarps to warm up soil in the early spring to speed up the germination for seeds that you direct sow in the ground. This method I would use for cool hardy vegetables in late winter or early spring and warm up the soil or help to thaw the soil so that I could actually start them outside. And also for those more tender annuals that need warmer soil to germinate, but nighttime temperatures are still below 60. Any plastic container will help warm the soil to that temperature that will help them to germinate. It's really akin to using a cold frame. A clear tote that's turned upside down with or without a few holes for ventilation can utilize the greenhouse effect to warm up soil in order to be able to plant sooner. I've also seen it done with a clear tarp or clear plastic biodegradable mulch. This is one of those methods that really only works when soil is thawed and the warmer air really needs to be trapped inside the plastic to keep the soil temperature up. Commercial farmers use this in cooler climates to get a stand of corn a month earlier than they ordinarily would be able to. Some seeds you can benefit from direct sowing without any cover, which allows for cold stratification and will improve germination for seeds. Lupins and delphinium are examples that benefit from being direct sown into soil during the winter so that they'll germinate in the spring. And in that case, you don't need any clear cover at all. So those are the ways that I've modified and really sort of cheated with winter sowing in order to experiment and get more plants. Have you tried winter sowing the classic way? Are there any adaptations of the method that you've found to work for you? I would love to hear from you in the comments section. And if you've found this helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing the content so that we can help more people find joy in growing. I wish you joy, and I'll see you next time.